What
This
we
conference will now be recorded.
what we do is we provide the charging software, we provide the equipment, we operate and monitor a network of charging stations, but we also take it beyond just the initial installation from engineering and commissioning and over program and the choice of hardware to smart charging optimization. And we also work with customers to electrify their fleets, and we work with auto OEMs such as Ford and Volvo continue to expand their own internal e-mobility offering. And so that can range from the Ford network to Volvo, where we're providing charging for heavy duty equipment. We also do grid balancing services. So from the beginning at our core at Greenlots, we have long worked with utilities and cities and others, but more prominently with utilities, we've worked hard across the years in the regulatory space to make sure that our voice is heard in terms of our thinking that utilities should be one of the key proponents of electrification, but also one of the key drivers of that market. So that's where we sit. We work really closely with cities, not just in LA, but all across the country. We have been working with Duke as well. So we're excited to see Florida continue to develop your roadmap and hopefully become a leader in this space to really showcase some innovative ways on between fast charging, level 2 fleets. I'm excited to hear from our partners today. So without further ado, so Doug has asked me to speak a little bit about my background in the West Electric Highway, to provide some fodder for thought and discussion. Back in the days of this market, excuse me, which is about 10 years ago, when the Nissan Leaf, you might remember, came out in December of 2010, and the Mitsubishi i-MiEV was also a vehicle that was out, and then the Chevy Volt. So there were very few options. Most of them were, of course, not very long range when it came to 100% battery electric vehicles. But when I worked for the state of Oregon, initially at DOE and then DOT, we really saw fast charging and long distance charging as something that was absolutely going to be required in order to really truly grow it. A couple of reasons for that. Number one, the way that we believe that the people who lived in Oregon traveled, we went places on the weekend. We needed a car that was going to be able to get from Portland, Eugene, and some of the other cities to more of the destination locations. So we wanted to go beyond just city charging to destination charging, rural charging. We really saw the way that and cities could help support this is by providing sort of a overview. And so what we initially did is we sort of looked at all of the locations throughout the state based on the Nissan Leaf's range. We planned out accordingly, right? So we decided to put chargers every 30 to 50 miles. And initially, the charging infrastructure that was available was not even UL certified, and that was 50 kW chargers. So we were very early. This was before there was a standard for SAE, which is the American and German standard. And initially, we just deployed CHAdeMO, which was the Japanese standard for Leaf. So we knew we were getting out front. I think the key takeaways from that in developing the West Coast Electric Highway, which basically crossed, all over the state and allowed a Nissan Leaf to travel up and down the coast 363 miles to up and down I-5, which is the main artery that connects Oregon, Washington, and California. One of the key lessons learned was we were fortunate enough in the beginning to really work closely with the utilities. I believe there were close to 20 different utilities for all of the different charging locations that we had throughout the state, ranging from co-ops to IOUs and everything in between. And what we found very early was we needed to work with the utilities to, one, of course, do site visits, but two, to work at a high level with the utility, because oftentimes we'd be going to the site with estimators, but it was important for the utilities to kind of have that oversight and push to accelerate this network. It was definitely a lengthy process on the site acquisition and permitting. We were definitely early, and unfortunately, I would say that process has improved as cities over the years have become savvy and counties and different AHJs, but it still remains a barrier. And there's still, even in California, there's a there's a lot of movement there to try to improve that process, but we still have a long way to go. And some other lessons learned other than the site acquisition component and involving utilities was demand charges. Our private sector partner at the time was AeroVironment, quickly realized that demand charges were going to be an issue. And if you're not familiar with that, with these 50 kilowatt fast chargers going into these locations and intermittent charging, it caused a little bit of a strain on their bills where they would get high demand in times of peak. So basically, AeroVironment was putting the bill essentially for the operation and maintenance. And this was in the early days as the business models were developing. And so even from fast forward 10 years to today, the business models are still fairly difficult to make corridor charging work. There's been partners in the industry that have made that happen, but one of the key components to making those financials work is utilization. The West Coast Electric Highway having been done between the different state entities through federal funding, we were able to, invest in that network and not have utilization as a key driver for success. But as a private sector employee and somebody who's constantly assessing these types of projects and opportunities, it's really important for us, specifically at Greenlots, to try to deliver on that promise of widespread electrified transportation, but to do so in a way that's sustainable beyond an initial infusion of grant funding. So the evolution over the years from the West Coast Electric Highway has pretty much remained in terms of the experience that we had, but it's just on a bigger scale. And, going from 50 kW to now 150 kW through Electrify America's deployment, for example. Greenlots is the software provider for that. We've definitely learned a lot across different regions throughout the country. So we'll dig more into that as we facilitate this session, so it's not just me talking, because I could probably brain dump for a long time, Doug. But I think one of the things that Doug and I interacted early on that would really be something that's relevant to Florida is the work that we did to connect not just the infrastructure deployment, but how do we expand the messaging and amplify what we're doing with the infrastructure investment. So what we did was we partnered with several of our sister state agencies, and then quickly basically the center of gravity for electrification went into the governor's office. And I think that helped a lot, because what that did is pulled, we didn't have a lot of resources as much as California would have. You might think of Oregon as having a lot of resources for electrification, but we really didn't. So what we were trying to do is harness the existing assets that we had within state agencies and trying to build up the expertise, whether it was in DOT or on our building code side or with our Department of Environmental Quality on the regulatory side. So I think that we helped empower a lot of employees throughout the state to help facilitate the market, but not necessarily own it, and work with in a public-private partnership mentality. So one of those public-private partnerships that we did was with Travel Oregon, and we developed a wide EV tourism campaign. And I think that would be really something that the state of Florida could focus on, in partnership with the city of Orlando and other cities throughout the state. I think having a really robust network of fast charging that is, of course, reliable, has redundancy, has the most advanced technology as possible in partnership with the utilities that through open standards would really help, I think, expand EV adoption in the state and also highlight Florida as a leader in that space. So I'll finish just by describing a little bit. Doug asked me to describe a little bit what we did with the EV tourism. We had partnered with the state tourism agency to create what we called the Oregon Electric Byways. So what we did is we created itineraries based around the fast charging network that we had deployed. And we tried to couple the idea of an expansive network with the idea of an expansive experience. So we didn't want EVs to be looked at as a sacrifice per se, and even at the time they were with a limited range, but we wanted to make that travel experience as enjoyable as possible and try to vocalize all of the benefits that come with driving electric. And then the other component to that I think would be relevant and to parlay into what you're doing in Florida is really working with those communities to attract additional investment. So every time we put in a fast charger in a particular community, it really gave the permitting and all of the people within the city, as well as the overall community, such as the Chamber of Commerce and other key businesses and employers, enlightenment into what we were doing. And there was a push for L2 deployment. So if we put in a fast charger, there was a lot of sites that wanted that fast charger at that location. And unfortunately, obviously, we had to go with a site that made sense within the parameters that we had outlined for site acquisition. But a lot of the sites that didn't get those chargers putting in level 2. So you started kind of seeing this ecosystem of charging, if you will, where the community at hand had more access. And we saw, rural utilities such as Central Lincoln, PUD on the coast start to take leadership on their own right, from, organizing EV parades to incentivizing EV to providing incentives for charging at a residence, and really starting to think about how their community fits into the larger footprint of a statewide network, and then of course a West Coast network. And then I'll close with just saying that one of the things that was extremely helpful for us was partnering with our neighboring states, initially just Washington and California and British Columbia, but it started to set the standard for what a regional network of charging stations look like, and it also gave our all of the experts that were needed for the private sector to come in and develop some of these networks, that expertise and understanding of what is needed to try to facilitate as rapid of an installation as possible. I think the market is moving extremely quick. Makers are coming out with extremely compelling vehicles that are long range. And one of the key things to keep in mind is, how is this going to function in the private sector beyond government funding? Because I think that's what we found is extremely critical. And, as far as my current role, constantly working with cities and other entities and investing our own. But I think, the future is definitely in fast charging for long distance charging, but I would, also advocate for looking at really innovative deployments in the level 2 space when it comes to fleets and also residential. And we can kind of get a little bit more into that, perhaps speaking about workplace charging and serving multi-unit dwellings as well. But there's definitely a long way to go with this market. I'm excited to hear about the work on the fleet side of things. There's a lot of people out there that have experiences and lessons learned that can help guide you, as you move forward in your deployment. But I think there's a lot of also creativity that could be highly localized that can really make a difference when it comes to scaling EV adoption in your state.
Well, Ashley, thank you so much. I think everybody got a pretty good idea of how long you've been involved in this and how much you've seen. And once again, thank you for joining us. I will make the comment that Oregon, during the time that Ashley was speaking of, had no incentive for EVs, for the purchase of EVs or any other kind of incentive that I'm aware of. And yet they were number 3 in the country in the number of EVs that had been purchased. So, and I personally think a lot of that had to do with just the holistic effort that went into this, destination charging and understanding where people were coming from and what they wanted to do. So thanks again, Ashley. As you said, we'll dive into those a little bit more. David, you're on the line now. David is with the City of Orlando. He's the Division Manager of Fleets and Facilities. David is in the forefront of alternative fuel fleets. He's got everything but a hydrogen vehicle in his fleets. He's got electric motorcycles for the police department. And I think something on the order of about 85% of his vehicles run on alternative fuels. So David and the city of Orlando have been working together, installing charging infrastructure in the city. And so he has a lot of experience in multiple fuels. but he's definitely a leader in the electric environment. So Dave, would you like to say a few words here?
Yeah, I'd love to dive in. In fact, Ashley, you just did a perfect segue for me to talk about the operational side of the stuff we do. So I'm grateful for that. Doug failed to mention that I'm also the chair of the Central Florida Clean City Coalition and serve with great honor that I get a chance to play with that. I did 8 years in the military and aviation in the Navy and the Air Force with helicopters. I also did 23 years in aerospace working on the shuttle before I joined the city in 2006. I've been here ever since, and I thoroughly love what I do. If you want to look up my fleet garage, I'm going to give you a quick address if you want to jot it down. It's 1010 South Westmoreland Drive, Orlando, Florida, 32805. For those of you of interest, what you'll see when you go to that on Google Earth, you'll actually see my fleet garage, which looks like a big H. And on top of it, we've got a 420 kW solar array right now. And I'm going to talk briefly about how we're going to be expanding that even further. But Doug mentioned the percentage of vehicles in our fleet that are alt fuels. I think we're currently at about 92%, which is pretty cool for me. EVs is a big piece of it. And I'm going to talk primarily about EVs right now. We have currently 75 all-electric, low-speed EVs. We have 96 hybrids. We had 6 of the original first-generation Nissan Leafs when they came out. After the tsunami, we couldn't add to that. Originally, Mayor Dyer wanted us to ramp up to 15. But I do have 15 of the new extended-range bidirectional charging Nissan Leafs in inventory today. I do have the 4Zero motorcycles that the police absolutely love. I have 30 Chevy Bolts. I still have some Volts in inventory. In fact, if General Motors was still producing them, I'd buy more. I have 2 orange EV yard dogs. These are big tractors that replace diesel Kenworths out in the fields. They are pretty cool. I've also committed to Ford. I've already said that I will buy 150 of their F-150 EVs once they're able to produce them and get them to me. I'm excited about that truck. I just think the technology on the skateboard is a perfect solution to bring to market for public sector fleets. Currently, we have 218 charging stations that are inside the gate for our EVs. We are currently deploying in unison. Actually, we're hiring Orlando Utilities Commission to do the install. We're adding another 200 outside-facing charging stations right now in this market that the city's paying for. It's kind of a joint thing with OUC. I've got a couple of motor pools, one at City Hall that has 6 EVs. Those are all Chevy Bolts. And then I'm going to expand the solar array here at Fleet to cover our motor pool area, and we're going to have 32 spots that'll just be EVs underneath that, and one of them is going to be a fast charger. And OUC is working with us in partnership. They're actually going to bring in and set down a Connex box-sized battery so that we can work on vehicle-to-grid, vehicle-to-building technology, trying to prove that on a grander scale. So we have all of those things going, and I just can't get EVs fast enough, quite frankly. The adoption with EVs was a little slow in the beginning here in Orlando, but with the hybrids and the pure EVs, as we've deployed them, it's just been a win across the board for us. So I've got a lot of experience to talk about how to get in front of council, how to get in front of the C-suite and talk about it, make the sale, and then the blessing I have, quite frankly, is the city of Orlando gives me the opportunity to just run as hard and fast as I can as long as there's money to cover cost, and return on investment always makes sense with EVs. So it's an easy sell for me. And again, Ashley, you set me up perfectly.
Oh, thank you.
Dave, yeah, Dave, thanks a lot. And yes, if you do get the chance, have a look. It's an impressive facility that David has. It's an impressive operation all the way through. So David, thanks for joining us today. Helda Rodriguez is on the line. She's with NovaCharge. I think she's the president, and she may have promoted herself. But anyway, they manufacture EVS products, and they also are in the installation theater. So they put shovels in the ground and pour concrete. And Helda has got a wealth of experience in installing and designing EVSE systems in the state of Florida. So Helda, with that, would you like to take a few minutes and tell us about yourself and your company?
Yes, good morning, Doug, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with the group today. So to tell you a little bit about NovaCharge, we were founded in 2008. We are a Florida-based company, and we were founded exclusively to bring EV infrastructure to the marketplace. It was important to me that as efforts were going on in California, that we bring this technology to Florida and help grow Florida. I am a native, which makes me, I guess, pretty rare here in the state, but bringing high tech to Florida was very, very important to me. And so we decided, with the support of, the folks here in Orlando, to move our headquarters here. And so in 2008, we got busy introducing charging stations. So NovaCharge was involved in the development and bringing to market smart charging. Giving out electricity was nothing new. Every dock in America had basically a charging station. You could go to any campground in America and get a charging station. What was different was the ability to be able to control that equipment. And as Ashley said so well, demand response was going to be critical for success. So the only way to be able to marry those two together and have communication that allowed for demand response and large scale deployment was to bring smart infrastructure to the marketplace. So some really important firsts for NovaCharge. We sold the very first smart charging station in the United States. We had the very first commercial sale of a smart charger to a major customer with McDonald's back in July of 2009. We had the very first point of sale transaction over an EV charging network, and that was with the DC Department of Transportation. We handled the deployment of over 600 charging stations. We launched 2 cities. We were the first to launch the ChargePoint America program, which was a $37 million Department of Energy infrastructure program in 2010. Very, very proud to say that that unit is still in service. It's sitting in front of City Hall in downtown Orlando. It was a very, very important step, but that was the very first smart charging deployment as part of ChargePoint America in the US. And then we followed with the second launch in Washington, DC. Like I said, overall expanding from Orlando into the Tampa Bay region, then down south all the way into Sarasota and a little bit of Bradenton. And then in the Northeast out of DC, getting into parts of Virginia as well as Washington. So our experience really goes, way back in developing and bringing products to the market. So in 2008, we saw smart charging as being critical in order to support the deployment of these vehicles. By 2013, we started working to create an open standards and working with folks at Greenlots, because we truly believed that, given the fact that we had seen some players in the industry that had stepped out, and all of a sudden you had infrastructure that was abandoned in the ground, it became very, very important to us then to be able to drive open standards. So over the past few years, we've embraced that and continued to develop and build new products that embrace open standards, meaning OCPP, allowing the hardware to be completely agnostic of the network that supports it, making it completely portable, just like your cell phone. So you don't throw your cell phone away. If you've gotten upset with AT&T, you just port it over to T-Mobile or another supplier, and your services continue. So for us, it was very, very important when we saw folks leaving this market that we would have infrastructure that would be able to be redirected and therefore scale easily and have longevity. Over time, we've discovered that system design is critical to the success of deploying infrastructure. It's not a one-size-fits-all environment. We have to listen to and take note of the location that we're going to be deploying in, and making certain that several things are met. Number one, that we're selecting the right product. If we have infrastructure that's only a 208, 240 transformer, then to keep costs down, if we can order product that's 208, 240, that's going to save a significant amount from having to put in a step-up transformer. It also removes another point of failure in the system, making it extremely reliable. The other factor, and it's funny because recently the folks at EVBox took a poll, and they asked, what's the single most difficult point of failure? And it turned out to be signal strength, because at the end of the day, if these units cannot communicate, then you don't have service at them. So taking into consideration signal strength and who the best provider is at the location is all a critical part of system design. And then lastly, we look at the location. Is it safe? Would you feel comfortable there, charging into the evening? Is it lit up to prevent vandalism? And again, to create a feeling of security. Is it ADA compliant? These are the things that, we found are critical in order to successfully deploy this infrastructure, is to look at the entire system design by properly selecting the equipment that you will deploy based on what's available to you. There, you can save tens of thousands of dollars in a deployment, because very often we'll walk onto a piece of property and someone will say, we want the charger there, and it will be 300 feet and several feet of boring that's required, whereas a couple of parking spots within 30 feet of the transformer and or a panel are many times available. So we get on site always looking at the way to keep installation costs down, because I think that really ends up being the biggest hurdle that we have to deal with. At this point in time, we've, in addition to the projects that we had running, we have recently deployed almost 500 charging stations with Duke Energy in the last year. So you can tell we run pretty fast. That's over about 300 locations. So these are not big sites. Many of them are onesie-twosies, but it means that we have to manage permitting and infrastructure build out at each of those many sites at a very fast pace. So, one of the things that we're looking at is coming up with a deployment strategy where we're a little bit more aware of the differences between permitting and permitting officials. We have one particular city here in Florida, and I won't mention who they are, but we've literally had to say we can't deploy there. We can't get through the permitting process. They, because of flood requirements, they want me to put the charging station 7 feet up above ground level. Needless to say, that is not viable or feasible in any way, but we have reached an impasse with that city. So permitting continues to be a challenge for us, and we have chosen to try to fight the fights where we can win. Unfortunately, that particular city will be just a big gaping hole because of the fact that they can't get their permitting officials to approve what is common sense, which is these units sit pretty much like a parking meter. They do not require to be 7 feet in the air to be able to be above the floodplain. So these things happen. Large-scale deployments are possible with proper planning. And our team is currently, like I said, finishing up a very, very large level 2 deployment, almost 500. We have approximately 50 DC fast chargers we've deployed. Part of our work with Nissan and also Greenlots a few years ago, we handled several deployments of infrastructure for Nissan back then. A lot of that product today, unfortunately, is no longer being supported. And so we're at a rip and replace situation. Again, part of it is the fact that it cannot make that jump to OCPP, and therefore it's not viable. So we are very, very much involved in making certain that infrastructure that goes into the ground is able to stand the test of time and survive. The City of Orlando deployment, as David mentioned, we're working closely with OUC and the City of Orlando, and hope to have a couple of hundred ports available for the folks in the Orlando region. So pretty much that covers. We have always focused on being unbiased in our products and our offerings, despite the fact that we do have our proprietary brands. Again, feel that it is not a one-size-fits-all environment, which means that we bring to our customers best-of-breed solutions and give them the options of picking the right tool for the job. And with that said, we are looking forward to a very, very good deployment here, and we have recently started our exporting to Puerto Rico and have started to grow our footprint there. So thank you again for the opportunity to present.
Well, thank you, Helda, and congratulations on all the expansion. And I also failed to mention that Helda is on the board of Central Florida Clean Cities Coalition, so I apologize to her and David both, but you can see why these folks are so valuable on a board like we have at Central Florida Clean Cities. They just have a wealth of experience. They have a ton of connections, and they're just invaluable as what I will call mentors in this space. So thanks to all of y'all for taking the time, telling us a little bit about your operations. They're all very, very impressive. And for now, let's move on to the discussion section. Oh, please don't tell me. Excuse me 1 second. I hope PowerPoint hasn't frozen. So. Yeah, sorry about that. Did have a little problem with the PowerPoint presentation. So we're going to have 2 sets of discussion, well, maybe 3 today, actually. And we've divided them into different groups to try and keep the topics together. So you can see here that we have discussions on siding upgrade, increased grid demands, EVSE outputs, the building codes and permitting, some of the problems that Helda referred to a few minutes ago. Signage and safety in these installations is a very important piece. And as as Helda also pointed out, ADA compliance is very big. We have some friends in Florida that put in some chargers and evidently weren't really aware of the ADA requirement, and they're having to make some modifications. So please pay close attention to those requirements. And then we'll talk a little bit about process improvements and streamlining needed in smart grid and other techs or opportunities. And then if any of the attendees or any of the facilitators want to bring up a topic that is not here, please raise your hand and do so. So we heard a lot about siting and upgrade from Helda and also from David and Ashley. I think that it was very valuable in what Helda had to say about units that are basically obsolescent. We'll be talking about those a little bit later, and that they've had to rip out these units and put in new units. So at this point, we've been doing a lot of talking. I would like to open up the discussion to the attendees and see if there are anything in these particular discussion topics that any of you would like to dive into.
David, this is Kyle Connor from Cisco Networks. How are you doing today?
Oh, good.
Doing fine, yourself?
Doing great. First of all, thank you. This has been incredibly informative. I really do appreciate it. So thank you, first of all. Being with Cisco, we look a lot at communications, and I heard one of the points along the way is all around connectivity, right? If these chargers don't have connectivity, you don't understand the demand, you don't have the ability to do payment and collection. We work with cities for citywide network infrastructures for things like ITS systems for traffic. Have you at the City of Orlando started looking at electrical vehicle charging on citywide infrastructures to overcome that communications issue anyway?
Well, typically when we do the installs, Helda can probably speak best to this. When we do the installs, we do everything turnkey. They do get access through the city's infrastructure. But for example, anything that Helda installs for us comes with, they facilitate that infrastructure connectivity as part of their package. Helda, correct me if I misspeak, but some of that actually goes over the cell network as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's all wireless communication, cellular modem to these units. Using the light infrastructure has been challenging for us because most of it's run on 277 volt, which would require a step down transformer at the locations. So we haven't actually taken advantage of tying into to that at this point. But we recognize that communication is really the key to keeping both data costs down and to ensuring reliability with these units. So, I'm well familiar with Cisco, and that level of reliability that we have, for communication is what's going to be required in this equipment long term. And I think there's a lot of research going on as to the best way to connect.
Did that answer your question, Kyle?
Yeah, no, it did. Great. We just know cities everywhere are looking for communications and always looking for ROI. And if this is a use case that can adapt to that ROI, it's just one more, right? So just looking to see how you're addressing it today.
Yeah, and people like you can help us from the outside in because, between us, we always have our IT group. And the first thing that IT says when we talk about bringing anything into the network is security. They, you know how they are. And that's good. Absolutely. Because they protect us. But we do have with a variety of other things aside from our charging stations, but all the other software programs that we use, even those that are in the cloud, some of the new technology that we're deploying for telematics, there's issues that we have to go through this process with IT to make sure that there's not going to open the door for something. So you understand the potential of it, and we need people on your side of the fence having the communications with IT to help us sell them, particularly on systems that are tried and true.
And the only other question I had, and I don't want to monopolize it, but what other impediments do you have, given the fact that EV penetration is still relatively low these days?
Really nothing on the EV side, and it's easy for me. I should have mentioned GreenWorks Orlando for anybody that's on the call. It's on the city's website. If you just do a Google search for GreenWorks Orlando, GreenWorks Orlando covers the entire it covers the entire spectrum of all things sustainable. It started in 2007 with the city of Orlando. Only Mayor Dyer and I still exist from that original team that created it, but it's morphed and grown, and it touches literally every aspect of the city of Orlando now. So that in and of itself knocks down the barriers that used to be in the way when we talk about doing things that are sustainable in nature. It's just the way that we conduct business, period. So that helps. It also helps on the IT side of things. But again, anytime I want to bring in some new tech that potentially has a positive impact on us, if it's in the cloud or if it's got a ride on the server, we have to go through that process with IT. There's a company out of California called Revo that I'm running the pilot program on their tech right now, which is really great telematics. But it took a long process to go through IT, even though everything's cloud-based, to satisfy that availability for connection. So those are the only impediments that I run into. It's just a time factor is all.
And Kyle, I will add that, having a strong ROI or even being able to create a good ROI on this equipment right now has been challenging. We're closer to it with DC fast charging than we are with level 2. Over the years, side advertising, different business models to try to create a viable ROI have been tried. And I think that over time, the goal here being to make sure that even with demand rates, with utilities, I think that that's going to be one of the key things that we have to solve is pricing for demand rates, because collecting that from the driver in most cases puts them up over the price of gasoline, and we certainly don't want to see that happen. So I would say that, utility public service commission pricing is one of the challenges that we still face in order to be able to drive a strong ROI and have infrastructure where, as it scales, it's going to be easier to manage. But again, with grid demands and grid management comes maybe disappointing the driver, which is difficult. If you're a driver that needs to get from Tallahassee to Miami, the last thing you want is to get to a charging station and have it be demand rate set so that you're
Right.
Instead of getting your 150 kW that you were expecting, you're down to 50. And I think that time will teach us a lot, as it has in the past years. But I would say that that's really the biggest, the two biggest challenges that today we're looking to try to find an answer for. How do we manage the grid and yet meet driver expectations? And how do we create a return on investment that allows us to keep pricing at these units low and the cost of energy affordable to the drivers?
Yeah, this is Ashley. The other thing I would say, I think it was the gentleman from Cisco that mentioned the penetration and where we're at in terms of relatively low levels in certain areas of the country of EV adoption. It's definitely made a market improvement. I would just say that we're definitely at the inflection point, and I think just wanted to mention that the data is out there. I think the Bloomberg stat is by 2040, 55% of all new car sales will be electric. The automakers are investing vast amount of money into the technology. In this time period, there are many models coming out, and I think even in light of the coronavirus pandemic, there will be slight delays, but there's a continued entrenchment into electrification and continued investment. It may have a slight delay, but there will be more and more models. And what our research shows, of course, is that when consumers have choice, they tend to be swayed more easily, and having that optionality is really important. And then also, of course, I talked about it a little bit earlier, but I do think range, of course, is a huge consideration. And so while it might seem like there's a long trajectory, I think right now is definitely the moment for municipalities and utilities to deepen their knowledge, to continue to advance their connections within, whether it's a public-private partnership or just working internally to shore up your own process for how you would respond to this, assuming that there is an uptick. Because I think one thing we've seen, even in big cities like LA, is cities are under in a resource constrained environment as well, and oftentimes we're coming with within the telecommunications space, but also electrification space, with lots of requests. And I would just say that now is the time to, if you don't think the adoption is at the level that you would anticipate, just start preparing. And the last thing I would just wanted to mention that was helpful in the early days is having a point person, whether it's at the city or state level, if possible and feasible, that can coordinate all of these efforts. So I would just say readiness is going to be a critical component, and I think your EV roadmap planning process, of course, will lead to a really robust process.
Well, thanks, Ashley, and I concur. I think there is some urgency to what we're. No, I'm not. I think there is some urgency to what we need to do here, and Ashley mentioned, I think, an inflection point. I use the term tipping point, and really what I am concerned about happening is that these vehicles do reach price parity with conventionally fueled vehicles. And so let's say the fiduciary responsibility of a government agency comes into play, or a private industry entity, and they look at it and they have to buy electric because it makes the most financial sense, and they're required to do that. Now, what happens is, when businesses buy these, they buy them in large quantities, and so what I'm real concerned about is we hit that tipping point, and we have not been moving the infrastructure availability forward, and then all of a sudden the infrastructure is overwhelmed with vehicles that have 250 miles worth of range and take longer to charge. So, this is a very timely discussion in that we want to get ourselves in a position to accommodate what we clearly see as a substantial increase in electric vehicles for transportation purposes. And then just another comment about David and what he had to say about IT. I've worked in that environment before, and it is a complicated process for the IT folks, because they want to know what the MAC address of your device is. They got to assign an IP address. There's all kinds of back office management that has to go into these pieces, and not to mention maintenance and monitoring and all of that. So that was a great session. I would like to spend a minute talking about signage and safety, and Ashley, can I get you to give us a couple of comments on that? I had already said something about ADA, but can you give us a little bit of insight on your experience in that area?
Yeah, sure. I'll go into the deep recesses of my DOT memories with the signage, but we obviously, I think from the point of when it was in the early days, I was at DOT and we worked closely with FHWA to get the MUTCD, which is the Manual Uniform Traffic Control Devices, inclusion of the federally approved standard highway sign for if you're on the highway, the signage, which I'm sure all of you have seen it, if not deployed it yourselves. But it's the traditional looking sort of gas station pump, but flipped on its head, where you kind of have the plug. So it's simplicity. As always with anything with design, it could be improved, but the important is that it being indoctrinated into what people see on the highway was really important. And also from a safety standpoint, I mean, clearly most of the EV drivers aren't necessarily using wayfinding signs as their primary source of finding a station. But the important thing is that it sort of augments what you have, whether it be with PlugShare, my former employer, or Google, or whatever resource you're using, or the individual app, such as the Greenlots or EVgo or any of the other providers. Ultimately, you have the signage on the highway providing guidance on which direction to go. I think the difficulty is in a growing market with multiple charging stations. Of course, you're going to be looking for whichever charger you're heading to. The important thing that we really worked with the different cities is, the traditional thinking on signage is it should be the same sign, the same picture along the way. And we've seen other entities get creative with it at the actual parking location, and then sometimes less is more. So I've seen, specific signs that have, a lot of information, a lot of content that the person has to read, and oftentimes people turn off their brains and just don't read it after a while. So we really we found a lot of success at DOT with just simplicity. So we'd put the same sign on the highway, and then of course, as you get off the exit with a directional arrow, and then using that same sign at the physical location. And then there's a particular sign with a P and a red mark over it that says no parking except for EV charging. And that's what we found the most successful. And then, if possible, accompanying that with spray painting, similar to what you would see at the parking location with a handicap parking spot. So you're further enforcing the brain pathway and just allowing people to find chargers. I'll just add, when you're in a difficult, let's say a parking garage, it's, we've seen good and bad examples, but it's important just to add as much signage and wayfinding as possible, because oftentimes in a large parking lot, you're at the location that your Waze or Google Maps took you to, but you actually can't find the charger. And I think Hilda mentioned earlier, just where you put the charger sometimes isn't the most visible location. Unfortunately, it has to be close to the proximity to the transformer, and sometimes that means that it's in a weird hidden location. So it's important to have kind of notes in the app to accompany any of the federal highway signage. And you can find that. I can't remember the exact, I should remember this, but I can't remember the exact name. It's D something, D9 something. But anyways, it's in the MUTCD, and I would highly recommend using that.
Right. And okay, yeah. And one of the things on the safety side too is these places need to be, well lit and in an invisible environment. So do any of our speakers or any of our attendees see any unique opportunities in smart grid or other tech opportunities? We've talked a lot about the communications that needs to go on between these devices, but are there other tech opportunities or improvements that y'all see coming down the pike?
Okay, Doug? Hi,
Yes.
hi. This is Pete DiNapoli. How are you guys?
Okay, Pete, how are
Uh,
you?
with yeah, thank you. Yeah, one of the things that I'm now with Merlin Solar, and one of the things that we've been very active in is the integration of solar on top of reefer trailers and trucks and fleet transportation as part of a distributed energy supply to the battery. So I mean there's a lot of activity happening in that part, which I think has a relationship to the EV roadmap. So we're very active, excuse me, with a lot of the OEMs like utility and various manufacturers of the reefer trailers, as well as the lift trucks and various trucking industries. That's part, I believe, part of the infrastructure extension. I know it's a little vague, but still, these vehicles are active. They're running around the country locally, and they can contribute to the offsetting the grid, and extending the life of the vehicle system. And so those are some of the things. I know we're talking a lot about the grid extension and putting charging stations at certain places, and that's extremely critical, no question about it. But there's also the ability to add some charging infrastructure directly on the vehicles, and we've been doing this for a long time. So anyway, I just wanted to bring that one up, and I thank you guys for the work that you're doing. It's incredible. It's awesome. We're going to get there. That's no doubt about it. So thanks.
Okay, Pete, thank you. We're at 11 o'clock now, so let's move on and explore a couple of other topics here. We want to give people time for Q&As. We do have time for a last question if someone has one on this particular slide. Oops. Okay. Well, then what we'll do is we'll move on to this area of discussion, and this is energy consumption, the environmental side of it, education, outreach, and training, which is always a topic for discussion. And then it'd be really interesting to hear what your experience has been, and David, I'm going to leave you out of this one, not because it's, I was looking at rural, but I know you serve underserved communities too. So, having said that, energy consumption is going to be a significant and problem that we're going to have to see if we can minimize. Now, I know the electrical companies don't want to hear that, but the fact of the matter is we've already heard about what the difficulties are in achieving a return on investment. So anything we can do along that line to basically minimize the upfront cost and then also be able to augment the power capabilities of the unit going forward would be a wise investment. On the environmental side, I've heard people say, we don't want more vehicles. We don't care whether they're electric or what. We need more bicycles and more and public transit, and those are all very true. And we do need more of that. But these are enabling technologies for folks that can't afford vehicles and have to use public transportation continuously. And they're also enabling vehicles for last mile applications in the transit environment. So, I think I'll let it go with that. And maybe see if some of our facilitators have some comments on that. Anybody like to speak to that?
I have to jump off, but I can apologize for having to go on to another call, but I can just add something to your point before I do. I think one of the things that we've looked at with in particular like cities in Houston and Raleigh as we've worked with them on developing their EV readiness plan, going beyond the light duty vehicle and personal vehicle. I think, of course, electrifying TNCs. As I'm hoping that that can be discussed. There's so much more where that came from, and I know we're seeing a lot of decrease in TNC utilization overall, but there's still a focus and a need for cities to make sure that the requisite environment is there to facilitate TNC electrification, and that can range from working with the utility to install, let's say, a DCFC hub. And we're doing that with cities right now in the right of way. And it can be challenging for sure, especially because the drivers, have limited compensation and oftentimes limited time, and time is money. So it's really important to make sure that where you're siting these chargers, if you want to facilitate shared mobility, electrification is really critical, because it needs to be, a highly utilized location with and reliability, because this is their compensation for their employment. So we're looking at that. And then I know Chris Castro and OUC, Pete Westlake, and the team there in Orlando and hopefully beyond are working really hard to electrify transit. So we see it as, the full gamut of electrification, from transit to TNCs to, residential charging, workplace. So I think for a community in a region to be a leader, it needs to go beyond just individual ownership, and we're seeing success in that realm, especially as society continues to shift. But we do continue to see fleets as an important driver. So I'm excited to see what you're doing, David, and other fleets in the area, because I think that again gives people the confidence if you're investing in that technology. And then it also, with the infrastructure, it's really unique to look at fleet charging coupled with public charging. Oftentimes maybe a depot or a particular location isn't the best location for charging your fleet. So there might be some ways to kind of combine assets and budget streams to install chargers that maybe the public can use as well as fleet. So I would just leave it at that, but definitely think it's important to electrify TNCs in transit.
Well, thanks, Ashley. And thank you for joining us. I know you need to go, and let's see, it's 8 o'clock out there on the West Coast. So anyway, thank you so much again, Ashley. It was great speaking with you and hearing from you, and look forward to talking to you in the future.
Thanks, Doug.
Take care. David, go ahead.
No, Doug, this is Kyle. I had a quick question from a training perspective. You mentioned the transits, which are clearly going for electrification, as Ashley just mentioned, but have you seen any uptake within public safety? I know like the US DOE just recently announced some grant funding for education around electric vehicles for first responders. Are you in the city seeing any uptake with your brethren in that space?
Well, David is probably the best person, and we may have some folks too that are attending. But David, can you speak to that?
I can. The uptake in public safety on the EV side is a little slow on the police more than fire. Fire's got an interest in some things, but police naturally worry about range anxiety. The Orlando Police Department, they all drive their vehicles home as well, so range anxiety sets in a little deeper for them because most of them don't have anything but a level 1 charger at home. And if they get halfway home or they get home and have to come back, they might be charge concerned. What I have seen, which has been of a surprise to me, is the uptick of hybrid use. We started with 15 of the Toyota Camry hybrids in the motor pool, And when police would come in and turn their marked unit in or their unmarked unit in for service, and we would put them in one of the Toyota Camry hybrids, they just absolutely fell in love with the hybrid vehicle. The good mileage on it, and the one anticipated thing on the Toyota Camry hybrids that I never expected was that they just don't break. They come in for PMs, they never get demand work. So we've probably got over 40 Toyota Camry hybrids deployed to police, another 20 to fire, and our current police chief asked me to get some of the hybrid Ford Explorer pursuit units. So we've got 60 of those coming right now. Again, they're not a pure EV, but they're a hybrid. So I see the hybrids as almost a transition for the police and for the fire department, because they're starting to get the interest. There's an interesting story on the Zero motorcycles. Originally, we have 36 motorcycle units in the police department. And originally, when I tried to get them to go to the Zero motorcycle, it was nothing but a no. And when we finally brought 2 Zero motorcycles in just for police to take a look at them, we had a standard street bike and we had one outfitted for police. And most of these guys are older, grizzled Harley Davidson riders that are not going to get on a toy electric motorcycle. But when we got music.
Thank you.
But when we got the Zero motorcycles here, and we had about 12 of the officers sit through a safety class before they could ride, it was just really funny to watch the transformation that took place, because you had these old grizzled guys sitting back, arms out folded over their chest going, yeah, I'm not giving up my Harley for one of these toys. But when we got them out and let them ride the bike, they took off with some trepidation, and they came back looking like kids from a candy store. And then we kept the one marked unit for 2 weeks for them to use, and they actually did a POTUS visit while they had it. And then we couldn't get it back from them. We had to chase around for 2 more weeks just to find the motorcycle so we could get it back. So they quickly adopted to the 4 that we bought for them, and it's just been funny to watch that transition. And those are the guys riding the electric bikes that are interested in migrating to the electric platform. I've got one patrol officer who comes in, he drives a marked unit, and when he comes in to turn his unit in for service, he very specifically asked for a Nissan Leaf to be his take-home vehicle, so that he can, because he drops it off at night, comes back in the morning. And I asked him one day, he was moving his equipment in the rain, and I went out to help him. I actually apologized because all we had was a Nissan Leaf to put him in. And he looked at me and he goes, Mr. Dunn, if you put lights and siren on it, I'll drive it today, because they love the acceleration. So we're going to put them in some of the extended range Nissan Leafs we bought just to see how that works for them. But I'm seeing the ice begin to crack on public safety with the more long-range vehicles. That's why I'm so excited about the potential Ford F-150s. You know, if they'll come out with a Ford F-150 with a 400-mile range, I can put a cop in that all day long. So I think that's really going to be a bigger icebreaker for me when it comes.
Yeah, and there was a lot of the training element and the education element that came into play with getting those Zero motorcycles in over there. But again, as you can tell, you know, David and the city of Orlando are very progressive, and they're exploring all the opportunities that are out there. So, you know, when it comes to underserved communities and rural communities, you know, I had a discussion with some folks at FDOT the other day, and you know, I personally don't see extraordinary difficulty getting charging into underserved and rural communities. But until we get the vehicles introduced there, you know, it looks like we're going to have to do a simultaneous. But I think what we can look forward to in those communities is, you know, not necessarily a DC fast charger, but maybe a 30 kilowatt level 2. or a DC fast charger if it's in close proximity to an interstate corridor. The rural communities, there are some portable options that are available as far as EV charging goes. And, my recommendations there are, for a county or some other agency to invest in one of those transportable and relocatable EV chargers. And what you can do is you can put them out there and see just what the utilization is on them, and determine where might be the most appropriate place in a rural setting to place a charger. So again, I think that their requirements, just off the top of my head, would lend themselves to higher rate level 2 chargers, and then also some DC fast charging, but with an eye towards really selecting an ideal spot for that, and maybe being able to determine that through the temporary deployment of charging in some of those areas. Anybody in our audience, any attendees would like to ask a question or have a comment?
Hey, Doug. Hi, this is Corinne Demet. I'm here with EVgo. I'm joined with my colleague Adam, who's also on the line. If folks who are not familiar with EVgo, with the nation's largest public electric vehicle fast charging network, we're currently across 34 states with more than 800 conveniently located DC fast chargers. The one thing that I wanted to bring up in this topic, and I think this might fit in this discussion around support areas, is the notion of rate designs, and how do you provide, or how does the utility provide the right signals to customers and EVSE to sort of make those deployment of DC fast chargers and other types of chargers as well. So charging at the right time, making sure that the rate designs are done in a way that encourages or doesn't hinder the development of charging, particularly at times where utilization may be low. So I would just kind of add that as a topic of discussion, or even as a comment, that rate design sort of plays a central component to the discussion around how do you encourage greater deployment of DC fast charging and as well as other charging as well.
Well, thank you for Corinne, and excellent points. Managing the charging and doing a rate structure that is conducive to, incentivizing people to invest in an EV. I drive a Chevy Bolt. I have, and I love it. It fits my requirements very well. I don't live in the Orlando area. I live close to it, but I find that my Chevy Bolt will get me into Orlando and back out and I can do that on a level 1 charge. And so what we really need to do is expand this infrastructure and find ways that we can economically install infrastructure in underserved and rural communities that may have an even lower EV penetration, but still deserve, to be able to, experience and invest in electric transportation if they want to. So, Corinne, thank you for your comments.
Hey, Doug, this is Helda. Before we move on, I wanted to share a little bit of a story regarding the impact of outreach and education that a simple act can have. Maher Chevrolet out of St. Petersburg consistently leads GM in the sale of Volts. And this is basically a result of the fact that Maher chose to make their loaner vehicles Volts, which means that whether you come in, to get your truck fixed or whatever other vehicle you were driving when you brought it in for service, your loaner vehicle is going to be a Volt. And they explained to folks, hey, just drive it in electric and don't worry about it. If it, runs out of battery, it'll be fine on gasoline like any other car. And just the fact that they're putting people behind the wheel of these vehicles has enabled Maher to lead GM sales across the nation. And I think that this is a really simple way that we can start really being effective, and their success with that program goes to show you how a simple act of just getting folks in the seat behind the wheel is truly the best outreach and education that we can have with these vehicles.
That is very informative. Thank you, Helda. And what a brilliant idea, and it really doesn't. Actually, it probably costs them less, because they're running, if they're charging off time, or off rate. So great. Thank you so much for sharing that. Excellent idea. Okay, we've talked a little bit about Open Charge Point protocol. We had a discussion on thermal management the other day when the power service providers were the focus of the webinar. It just didn't seem to have any kind of issues surrounding it. I mean, I know the maintenance side of it is going to be higher and such as that, but it would be interesting to hear something from the community. We are running kind of low on time here. So what I'd like to do is I just would like to open it up to any of these topics. You saw where Ashley talked about the broad introduction of EV passenger shuttles and transportation network companies. So we've talked a little bit about obsolescence and the upgrade and the future proofing of the EVSE. We haven't talked really about uptime resiliency and backup power. But I'd rather hear from attendees and from our facilitators on any of these topics. So let's just throw it against the wall and see what sticks. If it doesn't stick, then, as usual, I have plenty to say on all of this stuff. So let's start with our attendees. The attendees, do you have any questions on these topics or other topics? Okay.
Hey, Doug, this is April. We
Hey.
have a question from the chat box about the ongoing maintenance costs for the equipment, and I guess who's taking care of that, and maybe this is from the city and county perspective. So this is probably a good question for David to answer and talking about the infrastructure costs there. So David, if you would address that and how the city of Orlando is dealing with those costs.
April, does it have to do primarily with just the chargers and the infrastructure behind, more so than the vehicles?
It did talk about the charging units and infrastructure. Yes, that's correct.
Well, the good thing about it, I didn't mention in my intro, but I also spent a period of my life before the military where I worked for Florida Power and Light, so I have an idea of infrastructure behind the scenes. One of the good things, I've been dealing with charging stations and infrastructure that supports them here with the city for 13 years. And the good thing about the charging stations and the infrastructure behind them is they're simply moving power, and they work or they don't. There's not a lot of maintenance that has to be performed on them. I have seen, Helda knows that we've had some charging stations that were installed early, maybe 10, 11 years ago, that didn't stand up to the the use that we were putting them through here on the fleet compound, where they were getting a lot of activity on a daily basis, vehicles coming in, being connected, disconnected, and we wore some of those charging stations out. It's just that start-stop seemed to go through them pretty bad. So we've had some chargers that have failed, but by and large, the systems don't really require a lot of maintenance. They either work or they don't. The only piece that I've seen that's a wear point on a charger might be some of the retraction rails, but other than that, we really don't have to spend a lot of time, effort, and energy to maintain that equipment.
April, this is Helda. As David said, level 2 charging, it's pretty much plug and go. It doesn't require a lot. However, as we're getting into more DC fast charging, especially the very high powered system, these systems are liquid cooled, which means that they will require very periodic maintenance. You need to make sure that the pumps are working well, that the cooling filters are clean. And so there is more maintenance that is required as we do more DC fast charging. Level 2 is, as David said, very, very straightforward, but the PKW units are pretty much the same as the level 2s. You just, some basic cleaning, but when it comes to the maintenance of the higher powered equipment, you're going to have periodic cleaning of the filters. You're going to have possibly some oil that you're going to need to review and make sure that the levels are correct. So I would say probably twice a year, you're going to want to open those units up, tighten down all of the bolts, make sure that everything is properly seated. And then you have to deal with bugs in Florida. They find a way in. And so many times maintenance on these units is just getting in there, making sure we spray down, clean, and make sure that none of our critters have found a home inside because they can destroy components. So that's really what folks can expect, is that maybe twice a year, just a brief cleaning and just a dust up of a DC fast charger, unless it's liquid cooled, at which point it requires a little bit more care.
Well, as a follow-up question for that, what is the cost associated with that maintenance, that twice yearly maintenance?
Well, most of the manufacturers will offer you, maintenance plans. NovaCharge does, ongoing maintenance for everything we put in the ground. It's part of what we do, but it's really not anything other than setting it up when you purchase the equipment, so that you'll have that and you can get a competitive bid on it at the time that you purchase the equipment, because it does need a professional to be able to, that's been trained to open up this equipment and be able to service it.
Any other topics that attendees would like to address, or questions? Okay, well then, we'll move on towards wrapping this up. I also failed to introduce the Energy Office. April this is their project. We are contracted to help them develop a report, and it's been wonderful working with them. I do apologize, April and Sean, for just launching into this and mentioning that you guys have a part in this too. So they've been
no apologies necessary. There was a lot of work to get through and good conversations. Just wanted to quickly point out, if you haven't looked at the chat, there was a note from Ashley before she left. They're doing some work with the LAPD on electrifying their fleet, as well as the fire department. And so if there's any interest in that, she is happy to share information on those projects.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, with that, you can see this is the remaining interest group webinar schedule. No real need to get into that. Anyway, so we'll be meeting again on the 21st. These are so the same time, same access code, same link. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for those other discussions. And then also, if you didn't get the chance to ask a question, or if you have a question and you'd like us to answer it, please send it to Caitlin or myself or April, and we will get back with an answer. And if you want a longer discussion such as that, just give us a call and we'd be happy to set up time to talk with you. For now, that is, I think, the wrap up on the webinar. We will be posting a recording of the webinar on the Energy Office's website. That should be later today or typically tomorrow sometime. So if you'd like to download the recording of it and just be able to review it at your own pace, please feel free to do so. If you have any other questions, suggestions, please let us know. There's our contact information, and we'll look forward to talking to you again soon. Thank you for everything.
Bye all.